Hello, my name is Miriam Sarwari. I'm a first-year medical student at the George Washington University, and today I'll be giving a brief lecture on the gastrointestinal tract, specifically looking at neurohormonal control and innervation. So some of the objectives for today, we're going to begin by going over some of the functions of the GI tract and looking at what it does according to normal activity. And then we're going to go ahead and look at parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation, comparing and contrasting the two. And by the end of the session, we should know the function of each of the given systems as well as the neurotransmitters that they use. And we'll also understand the different paths that the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems use. And finally, we'll conclude by looking at the enteric nervous system and going over its innervation and its importance to GI function. So looking at some of the functions of the GI tract, we're going to start with digestion. The GI tract is responsible for both physically breaking down and chemically breaking down the food that we intake on a daily basis. And it's also responsible for absorption. So key nutrients and minerals that are in our food get absorbed by our GI tracts. And lastly, it's responsible for excreting the waste that we produce on a daily basis. So the functions of the GI tract are mainly digestion, absorption, and excretion. Okay, so autonomic innervation of the GI tract. There are three specific divisions that supply the GI tract. The first is the parasympathetic nervous system, then the sympathetic nervous system, and the enteric nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system are located outside of the GI tract. And that's why they're together known as the intrinsic division of the autonomic innervation. And the reason, again, is because they're located outside of the GI tract. The enteric nervous system, however, is located within the wall of the gut, and specifically is composed of the myenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus. And we'll talk about those in just a minute. So for the remainder of this lecture, we're going to go ahead and dive a little bit deeper into each of the divisions of the autonomic innervation and kind of see what their functions are. Okay, so first we're going to look at the parasympathetic innervation to the GI tract, and this comes mainly in the form of the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is responsible for innervation of the entirety of the GI tract, with the exception of the lower colon, which is innervated by the pelvic nerves. So here we have the vagal pathways coming out of the brainstem, and they innervate, like I mentioned, the majority of the GI tract. And it's also interesting to note that 90% of the vagal nerves are afferent nerves. And to go over some terminology, afferent nerves are the ones that take information from the periphery back to the brainstem, while efferent nerves are the ones that are leaving the brainstem and going to the periphery. So again, vagus nerves, 90% of them are afferent, so they're taking information back to the brain. And also the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for a stimulatory effect on the GI tract. So what that means is it's going to increase GI activity, whether it be pancreatic secretion, acid secretion, or simply motility. In contrast, we have the sympathetic nervous system. And so unlike the parasympathetic, where we notice the vagal nerves going straight to the GI tract, the sympathetic nervous system is actually going to synapse its nerve fibers before it gets to the GI tract. And it specifically synapses at three ganglia: the celiac ganglia, the superior mesenteric ganglia, and the inferior mesenteric ganglia. And so the pathway, it leaves the spinal cord, where the parasympathetic was leaving the brainstem, and it synapses at these ganglia and then goes to the GI tract. And as we mentioned before, the parasympathetic had stimulatory effects, as the opposite sympathetic has inhibitory effects. And this makes sense in the context if we think of the fight or flight reaction. We use our sympathetic nervous system. So in those situations, the sympathetic cuts down blood flow and resources to digestion and sends it over to the flight or flight mechanism, and that makes sense that we kind of puts survival over digestion. And then also, we mentioned that 90% of the vagus nerve was afferent. For the sympathetic nervous system, it's about 50% being afferent. Okay, so in this slide, we're going to go ahead and look at the preganglionic versus postganglionic of the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. So if you start with the sympathetic, as I mentioned before, the preganglionic nerve fibers are going to synapse at specific ganglia before they come over to the GI tract. So as you can see, the preganglionic is fairly short, and it synapses before it gets to the GI tract. In contrast, for the parasympathetic, you have one very long preganglionic nerve, which is a vagus nerve fiber, and it goes all the way directly to your GI tract, where it synapses to its postganglionic. So the key concept for this slide is to really note the difference in lengths of the preganglionic nerve fibers for sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, so in this slide we're looking at the neurotransmitters that are being used for the different divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So if we first begin with the sympathetic nervous system over here, you'll notice that the preganglionic nerve fiber is releasing acetylcholine to a nicotinic receptor. And that's actually mimicking the same thing going on in the parasympathetic pathway. You also have the preganglionic releasing acetylcholine onto nicotinic receptors. The differences come in terms of what the postganglionic nerve fibers are releasing. So for the sympathetic pathway, you have the postganglionic nerve fiber releasing norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors, while for the parasympathetic, you have, again, acetylcholine being released onto muscarinic receptors. So a couple things to note here. This picture is not to scale in terms of the length of the preganglionic fibers, which we just discussed earlier. The parasympathetic preganglionic fiber should be much longer. And then also to note that acetylcholine has a stimulatory effect on the GI tract, while norepinephrine has an inhibitory effect by decreasing the amount of acetylcholine being released. Okay, so previously we mentioned that 90% of the vagus nerve fibers are afferent, while about 50% of the sympathetic nerve fibers are afferent. So the question is, why are there so many afferent nerves leaving the GI tract? And the reason behind that is that there is a great deal of physiological and pathophysiological stimuli going on in the gut that sends important information back to the brain. So an example would be whether there's microbial signals or antigens in the gut, the brain needs to know. If there's nutrients in the gut, the brain needs to know to increase GI function to absorb those. If there's mechanical stimuli, if there's distension of the gut, the brain knows that there's food there and can start absorption. So the reason there's so many afferent nerves is because there's so many signals occurring at the GI tract that the brain receives information from. Okay, so now we're getting into the enteric division, which is the third division of the autonomic nervous system. So the most important thing about the enteric division is that it works independently of the other two systems we mentioned, the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And what that means is that if we sever the vagus nerve and the sympathetic nerve fibers, the enteric nervous system will still be able to take care of GI function. And the two main ways it does so is through the myenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus. And the myenteric plexus is located between the outer longitudinal muscle and the inner circular muscle. And as you can imagine, its function is to control smooth muscle contraction. And the submucosal plexus is located under the mucosa and its function is for mucosal activity. So this picture just kind of shows their relations to one another, and it's also important to know that the two plexuses are in communication with one another so that their activity can be coordinated. So in brief review, we talked about the three different innervations to the GI tract, The parasympathetic nervous system, we talked about it being stimulatory, releasing acetylcholine. And the vagus nerve serves to be the long preganglionic fiber for the parasympathetic nervous system. And it's important to note, again, that the postganglionic parasympathetic nervous system releases acetylcholine onto muscarinic receptors. And then we have the sympathetic nervous system, which we talked about being inhibitory. Its synapses at 3 main ganglia, the celiac, the superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric. And again, its postganglionic receptors release norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors. And finally, we concluded with the enteric nervous system, which is composed of the two plexuses, the myenteric and submucosal. And again, the enteric nervous system works independently of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So in conclusion, a comic that shows a relationship between the guts and the brain. And that concludes the presentation for today. Thank you for watching.